let me first tell you about my harrowing personal experience, and then offer my opinion on the way forward in Yemen. I was kidnapped and forcibly disappeared for over 5 months by the Houthis, taken from the street at gunpoint in broad daylight, blindfolded and shoved into a car. I was whisked away into the unknown. Without due process or access to a lawyer, my family did not know who exactly kidnapped me or where I was held. Thrown into a completely dark cell, I had to crawl on the floor to only find a thin and filthy mattress on the floor and nothing else. I've never been to jail before, and in a moment of panic, I started screaming and banging on the door. After what seemed like an eternity, the guards came with their flashlights, but to only beat me up to silence me. This would be a repeat scenario, as I would inevitably reach a breaking point after so many hours in the dark, and I figured a glimpse of light and a bit of human interaction, which came in the form of punches and getting flogged by sticks, is better than being left alone in the dark with my demons, and the feeling of being buried alive in that wretched coffin of a cell. Between the solitary confinement, the ruthless guards, the vicious interrogation sessions, I'd be lying if I said there weren't times when I hit rock bottom and I contemplated taking my own life. This was especially the case when during my interrogations, I was constantly being threatened with death and that they would go after my own family if I didn't confess to trumped-up charges. It is actually a miracle that I made it out in one piece. I'll never forget the day I was released and I got to hug my 2 boys after thinking I'll never see them again. Some said I was extremely lucky, but the fact is, so many organizations and individuals came to my aid, and it was the magnitude of the unrelenting campaign applying sustained pressure on the Houthis that eventually forced them to let me go. Esteemed members of the Council, the Houthis continue to unlawfully detain humanitarian, UN, and embassy personnel, on top of thousands of others, in a systematic campaign that is meant to terrorize locals into submission and silencing dissent. I was shocked to see the condition of some of my colleagues in videos produced by the Houthis, where they were forced to confess to wild and scripted claims. I worked with some of these colleagues for over a decade and can assure you all we did was try and help improve Yemeni lives through programs focused on education, cultural exchanges, and development. The Security Council must call on Houthi proceedings and theatrical trials for what they are, a sham. The Council must also demand that the Houthis immediately release all detainees and end the practice of kidnapping and holding hostages for political gains. However,
President Houthis,
tenus par l'Iran,
by Iran, have still not put an end to their attacks in the Red Sea against commercial shipping in spite of resolutions 2722
ce Conseil.
and adopted by this Council. We reiterate the call of this Security Council in favor of the immediate unconditional release of the Galaxy leader and its crew, which have been detained for over a year. France reaffirms its attachment to the stability of Yemen and to regional security. France calls on Iran to end its support for destabilizing actions in the Middle East. France will continue its engagement in the framework of the defensive operation and the security and defense policy of the European Union, Operation Aspides, to protect the maritime security and freedom of navigation in conformity with international law and in coordination with its partners. Madam President, France has taken note with satisfaction of the recent release of a staff member of the United Nations and 2 staff members of NGOs, but dozens of local humanitarian and international staff members remain arbitrarily detained in violation of international humanitarian law.
Thank you, Madam President. We would like to thank the Special Envoy of the Secretary General for Yemen, Mr. Thomas Greenfield, and the Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Affairs for their briefings. And we listened very carefully to Mr. Hisham Al-Umaisi. The stagnant situation in the Yemen settlement is something that gives rise to growing concern, despite the fact that for almost 2 years there's been discussions of agreeing parameters on normalizing a situation in this country. The desired outcome there, launching a fully fledged political process, is not there to be seen yet. And this despite the fact that the warring factions state that they are ready to take the agreements arrived at to the stage of the signing of a roadmap. At the same time, what's happening on the ground is the positions of various kind of radical forces are strengthened. There is a growing number of local incidents in the region of the line of contact, and we cannot fully exclude the possibility of hostilities being resumed. It's clear that the situation in Yemen is impacted by a skyrocketing turbulence in the Middle East in general, and this includes a continued Israeli military operation in Gaza and the developments in Lebanon and Syria. But we see no reason why these conflicts should impede the inter-Yemeni negotiations. We are convinced that the Yemeni settlement is something that needs to be moved forward without looking over the shoulder at the situation in the Red Sea or the regional developments. Madam President, the window of opportunity is not going to stay open indefinitely. And the longer there is an impasse in the area of settlement, the greater the chance that the unilateral steps will be undertaken by parties to the conflict, and this is fraught with serious consequences for Yemeni statehood. In order to make sure that we avoid this bad scenario, what needs to happen is mediation efforts by UN need to be intensified. We stand ready to help them in any way we can. It would also be helpful for us to attain the result we all want if we had an inclusive dialogue with all political forces in the country, including Ansar Allah. This would be a good complement to the comprehensive efforts made in Yemen by the Special Envoy Greenfield. A fairly favorable background to resuming the normalization process is also created by the continued process of major regional actors coming together, the neighbors of Yemen, and we call upon all of the protagonists to follow down this road without wasting time. When it comes to the maritime security in the Red Sea, our position remains the same. We strongly condemned any acts which prevent the freedom of navigation and which present a danger for commercial vessels. We call on Ansar Allah to refrain from attacking ships and also to release Galaxy leader and its crew who have been detained now for more than a year. What needs to happen is an immediate end, putting an immediate end to the continue to this day illegal shelling of Yemen by the so-called coalition by the United States and their satellites. Such bellicose steps, contrary to the arguments of the Western aggressors, do not help normalize the situation in Yemen or around Yemen. They only push further away the prospects for peace in this country and reconfirm the Ansar Allah movement in thinking that pushing back against external foes is something that bears fruit. The history of Yemen shows that you will not be able to resolve anything using force. There have been enough bloodshed in the Middle East. Perhaps the time has come to gather stones rather than scatter them around. Madam President, we, of course, cannot not mention the long and acute humanitarian crisis in Yemen. According to the OCHA Global Humanitarian Overview for 2025, almost 20 million people in that country will need humanitarian assistance. Their living conditions remain very dire because of social economic turmoil, limited access to pure water, healthcare, and education. There's also a high risk of malnutrition, which remains. We also expect that there will be an increased number of infectious diseases outbreaks, including cholera. The number of internally displaced is almost 5 million, and mostly that consists of women and children. Rectifying this dire situation is very difficult. And unless we have the pulling of efforts of international community, including humanitarian funding severalfold, and remove the impediments for humanitarians, without all of that, it will be not possible to improve the living conditions of the Yemenis. In this context, we and our colleagues in the Council are concerned by the still remaining situation as regards the locally hired UN staff detained in Yemen. We think it is unacceptable to do anything that violates the privileges and immunities of UN structures and staff. We need to have full clarity on the situation there and make sure that we have access to those detained, humanitarian access to them. But at the same time, we are against speaking with our Ansar Allah using the language of pressure and threats. Instead of that, what we need is painstaking work on the ground, creating conditions for the eventual release of the detainees. I thank you very much.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Madam President. I extend my gratitude to Special Envoy Hans Grundberg and OCHA USG Tom Fletcher for their briefings, and Mr. Al O'Macy for sharing his personal experiences with us today. Taking this opportunity, I'd like to wish USG Fletcher every success in addressing global humanitarian needs and protection. I also warmly welcome Yemen's representative to today's meeting. As we convene for the year's final briefing, we reflect on the lack of progress since the adoption of Security Council Resolution 2722 in January, prompted by the Houthi attacks in the Red Sea. I'd like to address the following points today. First, reckless and unlawful Houthi attacks persist in the Red Sea and beyond, escalating to direct assaults on Israel, including Monday's drone strike on Tel Aviv. These provocations not only jeopardize regional stability and stall Yemen's political process, but also disrupt global supply chains. According to the recent International Institute for Strategic Studies IISS report, Red Sea merchant ship traffic dropped by 50% this year. It is imperative for the Houthis to immediately cease their reckless provocations. Exploiting the regional tensions since October 7 is unjustifiable. We hope that the full implementation of the ceasefire agreement along the Blue Line, as well as the recent historic momentum toward the political transition in Syria, will have a catalytic impact on the dynamics of the Middle East, leading to stability and political progress in Yemen. Second, over 6 months have passed since the Houthis' appalling arbitrary detention of more than 50 personnel from the UN, NGOs, civil society, and diplomatic missions. While some people were recently released, the detention of many others continues. We strongly condemn these unacceptable detentions that constitute a violation of international law. We would like to echo the Secretary General's most recent call for the immediate and unconditional release of all the arbitrarily detained, including humanitarian personnel. Third, each month we have been witnessing the declining humanitarian situation in Yemen. The latest UNHCR report confirms that the floods displaced 100,000 families, exacerbating the shelter crisis and the water scarcity. We urge the international community to refocus its attention on the deteriorating humanitarian situation in Yemen. The Republic of Korea is fully committed to continuing our active contributions to support humanitarian needs in close cooperation with all relevant stakeholders. Fourth, all UN member states, including neighboring countries, must faithfully implement Security Council resolutions, especially the arms embargo. In this connection, we urge UN member states to pay close attention to the panel of experts' findings in their final report of this year. As the chair of the Yemen Sanctions Committee, the Republic of Korea will continue its constructive efforts to this end. In conclusion, Madam President, we reaffirm our unwavering support for Special Envoy Grundberg's steadfast efforts in tackling multiple ongoing challenges and laying the groundwork for an inclusive Yemeni-led political transition under UN auspices. Although 2024 was a disheartening year, given the recent dramatic shifts in the region, we have a stream of hope for progress and positive developments in Yemen and the Middle East as a whole in 2025. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of the Republic of Korea for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of China.
主席，
President, I first of all thank Special Envoy Grundberg and USG Fletcher for their briefings. I also thank the representative of the civil society for their briefings. I welcome the representative of Yemen to attend this meeting. This is USG Fletcher's first meeting at the Council. I welcome him. I also wish to take this opportunity to reiterate China's firm support for the humanitarian work of the United Nations. President, the recent dramatic development of situation in Syria has brought about new elements of instability and uncertainty to the entire Middle East region. The situation in Yemen and that in the Red Sea may suffer new shocks as a result. The ongoing exchange of fire between Israel and the Houthis, as well as the recent Israeli message about its contemplating a new larger-scale strike on Yemen is a deeply worrying and disturbing development. I would like to again call on all parties to exercise restraint and refrain from actions that would escalate the situation. I emphasize that the sovereignty, security, and territorial integrity of Yemen should be respected. I reiterate that the Yemeni issue ultimately hinges on a political solution. The current stagnation of the peace process is not in the long-term and fundamental interests of the Yemeni people. All parties should demonstrate political will, take practical actions to gradually build mutual trust, create conditions for the resumption of dialogue, and jointly promote a comprehensive Yemeni-led and owned political process. China supports Special Envoy Grundberg in his good offices and calls on all parties to support him in his endeavors to bring the political process in Yemen out of the impasse at an early date. We're also concerned about the lack of any easing of tension in the Red Sea. We again call on the Houthis to respect the right of commercial vessels of all countries to navigate in the waters of the Red Sea in accordance with international law, to cease their attacks and harassment, and to maintain the safety of shipping lanes in the Red Sea waters. We call on the parties concerned to exercise calm and restraint and cease any actions that would escalate tension. According to the OCHA report, in 2025, there will be 19.5 million Yemenis in need of humanitarian assistance, with daunting challenges in food security and public health. The international community should increase its humanitarian and development inputs to Yemen and jointly help improve its humanitarian situation. China welcomes the recent release of the 3 detainees and calls on all parties concerned to increase their engagement and communication to push for an early release of all detainees. Before I conclude, I would like to emphasize that it has been 14 months since the start of the Gaza conflict. The negative spillover effects of the conflict are growing. Lebanon and Syria, as well as the Red Sea and Yemen, are all experiencing new turbulence. The Security Council should maintain its unity, take measures to promote a permanent ceasefire in Gaza as soon as possible, and a gradual de-escalation in the region, so as to prevent more countries from being plunged into catastrophe. We're ready to work with all parties and continue to make our unrelenting efforts for a political settlement in Yemen and for peace and stability in the Middle East. Thank you, President.
I thank the deteriorating humanitarian situation in Houthi-controlled territory. I want to give a special thank you to Hashim El-Omasi for sharing your heart-wrenching story, one that is unfortunately unfolding over and over again in Yemen as the Houthis continue to unlawfully detain countless individuals. I want to welcome the presence of the Yemeni PR. Colleagues, we have discussed the Houthis' disturbing actions at length, And yet these conversations have borne no meaningful change in the Houthis' behavior. They've not heeded appeals in this chamber nor consensus enshrined in multiple council products. Instead, they have ignored the clear demands in Resolution 2722 to end their maritime attack and release the unlawfully detained crew of the Galaxy leader. And they've failed to change their behavior following the Council's press statements last December and just this past month. On the contrary, the Houthis, with the help of Iranian-supplied anti-ship ballistic missiles, have only continued their reckless attacks, including on U.S. naval ships, a Turkish merchant vessel, and a UAE-operated container vessel. And they continue to target Israel. The Houthis' slick social media propaganda is clear evidence that they care more about blustering to foreign audiences than helping their own people. These videos are complemented by a concerted disinformation campaign to protect illusions of tactical success. This campaign is intended to weaken the resolve of regional partners and like-minded countries. Colleagues, that cannot happen, and it will not happen. Whether in this council or through partnerships like Operation S-Speed and Prosperity Guardian, the multinational community stands firm in our resolve to counter threats to navigational rights and freedoms. To that end, the United States supports strengthening UNVIM's capacity to inspect vessels bound for Houthi-controlled ports, helping mitigate the flow of weapons from Iran to the Houthis. Right now, these transfers are happening at an unprecedented rate, not to mention in violation of multiple Security Council resolutions. This must cease. What's more, and following the successful launch of the Yemen Maritime Security Partnership last month, we will continue to work with the Republic of Yemen's Coast Guard to control illicit activity along the country's coastline. Finally, we will continue to push for accountability for the Houthis and those who support them. Enough is enough. We have already warned that sham proceedings that could lead to executions of unlawfully detained humanitarian UN and embassy personnel are totally unacceptable. And last month, the United States demanded the Security Council call for the immediate release of all detainees, people who are effectively hostages and desperately want to come home to their families, as Mr. Al-Amisi was able to do. The United States was disappointed that some council members once again stemmed an effort to speak with one voice about these detainees. Disappointed, but not surprised. After all, it has become increasingly clear that Russia has its own political interests with the Houthis, an agenda that takes precedence over collaboration in this council. We've seen disturbing evidence that Moscow is actively pursuing contacts with the Houthis and discussing weapons transfers. And now there are alarming reports that Russian armed forces have recruited hundreds of Yemenis to fight their unjustified war in Ukraine. I'm sure my Russian colleague will deny, just as they denied that any North Korean forces are fighting the war on Ukraine, just as they denied that they would invade Ukraine in the first place. But the facts don't lie. And the fact is that despite Russia and Iran's nefarious meddling, the only way to resolve Yemen's conflict is through an inclusive political solution. Rather than continue their assault on the Red Sea and surrounding waterways, the Houthis must de-escalate and return to a political process, one that achieves a durable end to the conflict, one that addresses Yemeni calls for justice, accountability, and redress for human rights abuses and violations. Thank you. I resume my function as President of the Council. I now give the floor to the representative of Yemen.
اسمحوا لي السيد الرئيس.
Madam President, I would like to start by congratulating you on your presidency of the Council this month. We wish you every success in this endeavor. I also thank your predecessor, the permanent representative of the United Kingdom, for a successful
السيد
last month. I would also like to thank Mr. Hans Grunberg, Mr. Tom Fletcher, and we congratulate him on his appointment to his post. We wish him every success, and we're ready to work with him to ease the humanitarian suffering in Yemen. I also want to thank my brother, Mr. Hisham Al-Omaisi. I thank them all for their briefings. Madam President, numerous times we have reiterated in this council that peace in Yemen cannot be established without having a partner that renounces war, believes in equal rights for all Yemenis, rejects violence as a way of imposing their political program, and puts the interests of the Yemeni people above any other consideration. What is missing in Yemen today is peace in all its dimensions, because the Houthi terrorists supported by the Iranian regime refuse all international efforts to resolve the Yemeni crisis. The Houthis do not want to achieve peace. They refuse to seriously participate in efforts to achieve peace, insist on their positions, and have proceeded with an escalation on all fronts, including systematic economic war against the Yemeni people, all in the framework of a precarious truce that the Houthis do not respect. Consequently, this council and the international community must review the way they treat the behavior of these militias, which destabilize Yemen and the entire region. In this context, the government of Yemen reiterates its commitment to the comprehensive, just political process based on the terms of reference agreed. That is the results of the National Dialogue Conference and the relevant resolutions of the Security Council, in particular Resolution 2216. We reaffirm our support for the Special Envoy of the Secretary General, Mr. Hans Grunberg, and all proposals and initiatives to resolve the crisis in Yemen, to achieve the aspirations and hopes of the Yemeni people. The government of my country also hails the efforts of our brothers in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and the Sultanate of Oman to achieve the political process aimed at producing a political process that will lead to peace and stability in Yemen. The escalation by the terrorist Houthi militia in the Red Sea is not only a threat to Yemen, it's a threat against the international peace and security and regional peace and security, a threat against the freedom of international shipping and international trade. Houthis, therefore, continue to not participate in the peace process. This is not taking place in a vacuum. Their threats are due to the fact that the international community continues to ignore our warnings about the Houthi militia, which undermine the Stockholm Agreement, the Hodeidah Agreement, and continue to control this city and those ports and use it as a platform to attack international shipping routes and commercial vessels, launch missiles and drones, and engage in arms trafficking, which is against the sanctions regime in pursuant to Resolution 2140. These militias, supported by the Iranian regime, seek to destabilize the region and threaten international shipping routes and undermine all efforts at de-escalation and efforts to tries to find a solution and undermine the future of the Yemeni people, exacerbate the humanitarian conflict. Iran must cease this. They must respect the sovereignty of Yemen and allow the Yemenis to build their state. It's really the time has come to do this. The Iranian regime continues to provide the Houthis with experts, training, and weapons, including ballistic missiles and drones. This is a flagrant violation of the relevant resolutions of the Security Council, especially Resolution 2216 and 2140. This also demonstrates contempt for international efforts and the efforts of this august body in charge of maintaining international peace and security, as well as the efforts to attain this goal. These efforts should lead to the implementation of these resolutions, and the Council must adopt a decisive position to deter the authors of these crimes. Madam President, the government of Yemen calls once again the international community to provide support, economic support, and support for development in Yemen, to strengthen our security capabilities, including Coast Guard capabilities to take up the challenges that threaten international shipping in the Red Sea and the Aden Gulf. We welcome the efforts of the United Kingdom and its recent announcement of new measures to support Yemeni coast guards in the framework of efforts to combat piracy, trafficking of weapons, terrorism, and organized crime. The support provided to the Yemeni government to take up the challenges in the area of development and security is in the interests of all. It's also an investment in the stability of the region and the world. We also reaffirm the importance of operationalizing and implementing, rather, the mechanism of inspection and verification of the United Nations. The Yemeni government has serious economic challenges because the government is prevented from resuming its oil exports for the past 2 years due to the attacks by the terrorist Houthi militia against oil installations. The Yemeni people are thus deprived of important resources. This prevents also the government from paying the salaries to civil servants and providing basic services. Also, it puts pressure on our national currency, and the Yemeni government once again calls on the international community to support it and to provide it with the necessary support to find the means to resume exports of oil. This is a vital resource that will allow us to fulfill our obligations. In the framework of all these economic challenges, the government is seeking to implement a number of measures to ease the economic and humanitarian suffering of our people, put an end to the deterioration of the economy, and restore basic services, including developing plans and defining priorities for lasting solutions to development and provision of services. And this, of course, implies economic, financial, and administrative reforms to combat impunity and assuring transparency and fight corruption, which is our priority. Currently, we're convinced that the international community and our development partners and brethren countries and international organizations will support us in achieving the stability and recovery and strengthen government institutions and respond to our needs and ease the humanitarian crisis. On this point, the government of Yemen would like to thank brothers from Saudi Arabia, from the United Arab Emirates and other countries who help us economically and in the humanitarian sphere to attenuate the economic impact and humanitarian impact. Madam President, yesterday the people of the world celebrated the International Day of Human Rights, while the Houthi militia continue to commit crimes of forced disappearance and abductions against their own people in the areas under their control. These militia have targeted densely populated areas and continue striking against them, including the latest crime in Taiz Governorate, where the militia shelled a market using a drone, leading to 6 deaths and 8 wounded, including children. This crime is not an exception to the rule. It's a rather systematic approach since the coup d'etat that the Houthis conducted against the state, and it's part of their approach aimed at escalation in a number of regions in Yemen to terrorize the people and force them to displace and to undermine the efforts at de-escalation and erode the possibility of a peaceful solution. Madam President, we have always called the United Nations to take a firm and serious position in the face of crimes committed by the Houthis, which affect not only the Yemeni people, but also the staff from the United Nations and various NGOs that were detained and have for over 6 months. This also affects diplomatic missions. Unfortunately, we see this lax attitude in the international community vis-a-vis the Houthis, which uses a language that is not commensurate with the severity of the violations of international humanitarian law and human rights, as well as national legislation. The government of Yemen calls once again the United Nations and your august body to intensify efforts to ensure the immediate and unconditional release of these individuals detained, humanitarian staff, as well as all individuals detained